South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy held out the promise of a better life for all. Yet just over 2 decades later, poverty abounds, the country's unemployment crisis is worsening, and inequality is leading to increasing incidents of social protests and violence. Resentment and disillusionment are palpable, and young people are agitating for change and justice. By all indications, the promise of a better life for all is being betrayed. Nelson Mandela, the founding president of the new South Africa. He is well known for his commitment to forgiveness and his reconciliatory spirit, but in many ways was a man for his time. Since he left the scene after serving 1 term, just as he had promised, it has become very clear that you cannot build a nation, even on the shoulders of a giant.
When there are competitions like the World Cup, the Rugby World Cup, or the Cricket World Cup, or the Soccer World Cup, or AFCON, it seems a lot easier to identify with this nationhood because of the symbols, the Springbok symbols, the green, the gold, and all of that. But as soon as those periods are over, it seems again like there's this sense of alienation from this identity, especially when we are seeing a lot more harking towards ethnic nationalism, racial nationalism, issues around race relations and racism, which makes people again go into their lagers and come together in identity rather than political collective goals that we have as a society. And I think it's an opportune time to have a discussion about how well we have done in nation building, nation formation, but also to take the conversation even further, as you have done in your project, Indulamity project, and actually look at cohesion. How far have we come in terms of becoming a more cohesive society, especially after the era of former President Nelson Mandela, the founding president of our democracy, who we actually were able to rally around, and he helped us come to a sense of a united South Africa. But since his time, since the era of Thabo Mbeki, it seems like we are less and less able to come together around a sort of united sense of who we are.
In the first place, I want to say the notion of nationhood is an ideal for many nations. It's not a reality that many countries have achieved. Some are 300 years, 400 years in existence, but you still have those forces that pull them apart. That's the first thing I want to put out there, that it's not something you say, I've arrived. The second one, even when certain moments under certain leaders will look like we are tantalizingly close to touching that sense of being a collective, it sometimes wanes away because of a number of factors, and therefore you do have a roller coaster in a nation where you seem close, then you drift away, you seem close, and you drift away. With the South Africa specific project, to start with, we were one of the most bitterly divided societies under colonialism and apartheid. And the issue of identity had been institutionalized, had been embedded in our system. So it was not going to go away at a stroke of pen because now we had a new flag, a new president, and so forth, despite the efforts. The reason for that is because the honeymoon period when countries become independent can only be solidified if you have concrete investments in social and economic redistribution or justice. It can be cemented when you do have leaders like Julius Nyerere, who stick around, promoted the notion of nationhood amongst Tanzanians who were drawn from many tribes. And now, today, their sense of Tanzanianness is stronger than their small primordial identities. What happened in South Africa is that, one, you had a champion, Nelson Mandela, who was the face and the father of the notion of reconciliation, of coming together. He comes as a reassuring figure. He had some vision of where we would go. During that same period, there was a reconstruction and development program, which was bringing in material benefits, housing, new social grant systems, free schools for some of the poor, subsidized electricity, water, electrification. So during that period, there was a reason to be hopeful. There was a reason in terms of tangible material benefits, but also there was plenty of patience to say, in terms of the redistribution of wealth, of land, it would not happen overnight. It would be a process. So to that extent, you had the tailwinds which supported this particular project of nationhood. And you also had a champion and a face in Nelson Mandela. Fast forward, Thabo Mbeki also tried to articulate this, but at the same time, he raised the notion of two nations, one white and the rich, and one black and poor. He was beginning to analyze the reality of inequality. South Africa today has become the most unequal society in the world. And one of the reasons is the failure of government to come up with programs that would not just have growth, but inclusive growth and development. During that period, you had the reality of the apartheid geography. Blacks, in their concentration, were living in certain spaces. Whites were living in certain spaces. In terms of the socio-economic indicators, as they have been recently released, you still have the color coding of intergenerational poverty, of income, of asset security. All those things not being resolved within the first 2 decades have created friction where people are going back into raising questions about the whole project of our nationhood. It didn't help that you also had poor leadership. It was a precipitous decline of the quality of leadership. Not just the leader of the country, but in the corporates, in the civil society, in the churches, in schools, in different, organs of political formations. The death of leadership then agitated this situation, and during that period, some of them became identity entrepreneurs. They used identity either for political reasons, for business reasons, and many other things. Not to say that it ought not to have been to raise the issues of identity, issues of social justice, redistribution of wealth, but others would seem to look at it as something that should be a gift that keep on giving, and not define something beyond it to say, as much as today we could say we have these racial divisions, what stands beyond it? At what point would we say we have transcended this? To them, the reproduction of the race tensions becomes a big issue. And this comes from your far right, it comes from your far left. It comes from all different, spheres. So when you had no longer a champion of what the common vision was, the failure to define what the national interest is in terms of something that would rally even all different political formations and different segments of the society. All those things left a void. During the time of crisis, people then retreat to their primordial identities, use it to mobilize. You have seen this with the foreign nationals and the locals. When they see their lot not working well, then they will look at the other as the cause of their plight. It could have been people coming from KZN or coming from Eastern Cape, and when they are seen to be making it good in a certain space, issues of identity would be raised. So those are some of the issues that have actually worked the other way in terms of social cohesion. Inequality of opportunity, inequality of income, inequality in terms of asset security, inequality in terms of just accessing credit and financial support for those who want to start businesses or anything. All those things combined are at the core of current resentment and resistance.
Just over 20 years since Nelson Mandela left office, his legacy of reconciliation between races in South Africa is showing some cracks. And it is an undeniable fact that social and wealth inequality are to blame. The Black African majority may now be considered citizens, may wield political power, but economically, socially, and spatially, the new South Africa continues to bear resemblance to the old.
Cool. How have you been?
So I'm actually interested in discussing this whole notion of redress and redistribution. Obviously, South Africa's inequality is historical. It is underpinned by a capitalist system based on exploitation, extreme exploitation, and dispossession of the majority of citizens. And as such, obviously, to create this mass cheap labor, right? And during the struggle, one of the promises of the liberation movement was that they're going to reverse this dispossession, right? They're going to return the land, return the wealth, etc. And so it has been a big part of how we judged post-apartheid South Africa is how is it doing in terms of keeping that promise. So from 1994, obviously, until now, we've had a swathe of macroeconomic policies. And what, in your view, has been the positioning of redress, of redistribution, of land reform throughout this period?
You know, there's something interesting that you speak about. And many people either use the double R's or the triple R's. So redress, redistribution. And I would add one that we don't talk about as often now, which is reconstruction.
Okay.
Because I want to use that lens because, in my view, apartheid and subsequent phases of colonialism were really a program that was aimed at destructing the social and the public fabric of African life. And so in the democratic era, one of the key tasks that we had was how do you reconstruct the African society? How do you reconstruct the African psyche? And I think land fits into that. So much so that the RDP, if you read out the entire acronym, was the Reconstruction and Development Program.
Yeah.
Because there was an implicit recognition in that you needed to reconstruct what had been destructed. Because when we say reconstruct, unlike many other post-colonial societies, we couldn't have said that everything had been decimated. Yeah. It's quite clear that the white schools worked. It's quite clear that white agriculture worked. It's quite clear that white amenities, white public goods worked. And in Black life, very few of those things did. It was an exception if they did. And so, for me, the debate around land reform and redress is also about widening the aperture of what it is that we talk about. So that if we have a coherent framework, you're then able to embed land in that framework around how you think about issues of redress. One example of what happens when you have a very narrow formulation of redress is you then have this very equity and share exchange focused broad-based Black economic empowerment, which targets as an arena for redress existing companies that sit primarily in the listed space or in the formal sector economy, without really understanding that if you are really genuine in your conception of redress, you would understand that that redress takes multiple forms in different spaces in society. So you ask about land reform. The reality is that how we've approached land reform right through from the RDP program and the targets that were set there through to where we are now has failed to overcome what I call the agrarian dualism of African life. So I often make the example of where I come from. I grew up in Komani in the Eastern Cape, which traditionally for white society is one of the key areas that are crucial for the production of wool and sheep production, and maybe cattle and livestock here. Now, if you think about that for the black people that coexist in the same area, on the one hand, you had agriculture highly mechanized, using the latest inputs on large amounts of land to be able to produce for the domestic formal market and even the export market. On the other hand, you had subsistence producers, many of which include my own family. Subsistence producers, small plots of land, very weak integration into formal markets, yet let alone export markets. So from an agricultural perspective, that's what you're talking about. But rural life is not just about production. But you also add to that there are other livelihood forms that have emerged in the countryside. And the whole idea of, for me, true liberation of people on the countryside was also about how do you overcome not only this agrarian dualism between white rural life and black rural life, but how do you do that in a way that opens up the universe of possibilities that people can have to eke out an existence in a livelihood. And that shouldn't just primarily be on the land. There are other post-farm gate things that potentially you could be doing. I mean, if you look at historically white rural elites, in the pre-1994 period, a lot of them were engaged in primary production. A lot of them left that. They found themselves in a debt cycle, withdrawal of subsidies by the government through the GEAR program. And a lot of them ended up playing in value-added elements of that value chain, right? A lot of them played in, cold storage. A lot of them played in the development of mills. A lot of them started playing in the freight and in the logistics space. A lot of them started understanding that the agricultural sector value chain is much wider in conception than just putting a seed in the ground and certainly hoping that the weather and everything else will work in your favor. Now, is that an indication of broader state failure? I would argue not. I think what it is a failure of is a failure to recognize the limitations of market-based land reform. The reality is that the land reform debate, in the context of South Africa, where more than 50% of your population is in the urban context, is going to have to take very different dimensions to what it maybe takes in Kenya with a large rural population, or even in our neighbors in Zimbabwe. So how does, for instance, the debate on land reform engage the task of regularizing and formalizing planning in informal settlements? You can't have an informal settlement that's been there since 1994. Some of them are even named after our leaders. You know, it's still informal 25 years later. Surely it's no longer a permanent or a temporary settlement or a temporary informal settlement if it's been there for as long as some of these settlements have. And yet every single time we have any rain, many of the people who have decided to settle in many of these low-lying areas are at risk to lose life, property, and all of those things. And I think our debate has failed to take into account some of those notions. But by and large, I think the reason for that, for me, in my view, is also our aspirational template for what a world-class post-apartheid African city looks like. Now, we had an operation a few years ago called Operation Fiela, which in my view was not a cleanup operation. It was an operation to really hound out the informal sector from the city. Now, there are competing interests between landed people who have property, who are trying to defend the values of those properties, and people who are trying to eke out an existence. So the property owners, it's in their interests to ensure that there is nobody who is selling cows' heads in the CBD, right? Because they attach the value of their, property in relation to how European the inner city looks like. And yet we're in Africa, everywhere you go on the continent. The inner city is a place where poor people ply their trades. It's a marketplace. It's a coming together of people to create an exchange value, which is what an economy is about. And yet in this country, we've done everything in our power, pre-apartheid and even after apartheid, to try and segregate the city in a manner that makes it difficult for people to come together, create value and exchange value together. Our RDP program goes and builds houses on the fringe of the city. And then we complain when people say, I don't want to engage this labor market anymore. We've got 6 million discouraged work seekers, many of them young, who are saying, I don't want to go to work anymore. Because at the end of the day, all I'm working for is money for transport. For me, the task really is, if you really want an economy that grows, if you want an economy that's more inclusive, have to address this task of reconstruction. You have to address this task of how do you reconfigure, for instance, the township as a sociological phenomenon in the post-apartheid period. Amapulu took us to that place for us to go and die, right? But how do you now fashion the township as a different sociological phenomenon in the post-apartheid African city?
To what extent is the EFF right about the property clause in the Constitution being the barrier to land reform?
It's a moot point. Who's tested it? Has somebody gone and said, okay, sure, we're going to take Catherine Street and we're going to expropriate it without compensation in the public interest and define the public interest? Has somebody done that so that it then gets tested in front of a court of law? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think, they might be right, but I don't know if they're right, if it hasn't been tested.
Why do you think there hasn't been appetite in the subsequent ANC administrations to test it out before actually entering into the whole process of reviewing this clause?
So I remember, former President Mbeki speaking about the conversations they had with the Zimbabwean government and ZANU in the late 80s. And one of the things that ZANU did at that point in time was to say, let's maybe delay our demand for thoroughgoing land reform so that our brothers in South Africa can get their liberation and that kind of thing. And I think, in a very perverse way, the flip side of that has happened. So our policymakers have been, to be honest, really scared to do it because of what was happening in Zimbabwe and the chaotic nature of that particular land reform process, which was justified. The reform process was justified. I think the mechanism and the method, in my view, lacked the kind of structured coordination that would have allowed you to defend and sustain it.
I think up until the Kgalema Motlanthe review panel came with its findings about communal land and how it's organized, how it's controlled, how it's managed, that the spotlight has not really fallen on that to say, what do we do about those people who are under the rule or leadership of chiefs? What is their claim to the land? Should they be given title deeds to the land? How should that framework of land reform work in those contexts?
So there's two sides to the debate in my view. I think the one is, and I am very critical of a fixation when it comes to tenure form with title deeds. I think title deeds are an individual, capitalist, commercialized form of tenure. And many people that are calling for the titling of people, we even saw Johan Rupert working with the Center for Development and Enterprise, handing out title deeds to people in Grafrenet and many other places. And I'm very concerned with that being the sort of teleological end of the project, right? Because what it does is that it says in a country as unequal as ours, if title is your only form of tenure, it has the possibility and the potential to reverse that land reform process. So let me give you an example. Many people, including the DA, make the argument that give people title deeds so that they can be able to go borrow against that land and start their own businesses. Now, as somebody who started a business, I can tell you, even if I had that money when I started my business, it wouldn't have meant that the fortunes of my business would have been any different to what they are now.
Major risk.
But also, number two, it's a massive risk if I default, as we often see with the default rates, that land goes into the ownership of the bank. Now, I'm saying we haven't been able in this country to be more creative in our analysis of tenure, to take into account or even create new forms of tenure. And I think the ANC in the development of its own economic ideas. Many people are critical of it and they say, they never thought of land. But, the 1955 Charter says the land belongs to all who live in it. But what does that mean in this context? It means many of the people who work on the farms with insecure tenure, with very little productive capacity, very little access to export markets, very little access to technology, they have, in my view, in my reading of the Freedom Charter, a very strong claim on the land because they work it.
They work it.
They live in it. And yet, in our public discourse, very little about how we engage on the land reform project is about working people, and in particular working women, who live on that land.
Redress, redistribution, and reconstruction. South Africa desperately needs to effect these to sustain its nation-building and reconciliation projects.